The footage flickered with the static of a dying battery. A grainy thermal recording recovered from a drone found floating in the reeds. In the black depths of the Rio Negro, the camera captures something that defies known biology. It is a long, undulating ribbon of white-hot heat, cutting through the silt with a predatory grace. It does not swim like a fish. It glides with the rhythmic elegance of a monstrous titan. The screen cuts to black before the tail ever comes into view. This is the heart of the Amazon, the green hell, where the air is thick and the humidity clings to the skin like a wet, suffocating shroud. The smell of rotting vegetation and damp earth hangs heavy. Here, the silence is never truly empty. It is a heavy stillness, the kind that occurs when the forest holds its breath, waiting for the next strike to fall. Elias Thorne wiped the stinging sweat from his brow with a scarred hand that shook. He was a man built of scars and a lifetime of bad decisions, his face a roadmap of escapes. For decades, he had built a reputation as the man who could track what no one else could even see. But reputations do not pay bills, and the mounting debts back in the world of concrete were closing in on him. He needed one last score, a legendary kill that would erase his failures. He was not here for sport. He was here for salvation, and in his dark, predatory mind, that salvation took the form of a serpent that should not exist. At a remote outpost on the edge of the world, the air was thick with smoke and the frantic warnings of men who knew the river. Elias sat across from local guides, their eyes dark with fear they did not hide. They spoke of the Titan of the depths, a creature so ancient it had no name. To them it was a ghost, a nightmare. To Elias, it was simply a payday. He ignored their superstitions, focusing instead on his grainy images and the rumors of a monster. This was not the first time men who believed the world could be conquered had come seeking the impossible here. In the 19th century, expeditions vanished into this vast green void, their journals filled with sketches of serpent gods that swallowed boats. They were men who believed in gunpowder and steel. They were wrong. The jungle did not care about their maps or their pride. It simply opened its mouth and let the vines cover their remains until they were forgotten by time. The head guide, a man whose skin was as weathered as a mahogany tree, shook his head. He warned Elias that the jungle does not just hide secrets, it protects them. He spoke of the river as a living entity that had grown tired of greedy men. Elias laughed, a deep, hollow sound that echoed off the cold, corrugated metal roof. He believed in calibers and traps, not spirits. To him, the guides were just nervous laborers, obstacles between him and the glory he craved. He pushed his glass across the table, demanding they move out at dawn. Hours into the trek, they came across a small clearing where massive trees had been snapped like toothpicks. In the center of the mud lay a heavy supplies crate from a previous corporate expedition that had gone dark months prior. It had not been scavenged. It had been crushed. The steel walls were flattened into a horrific cube, as if a mountain had collapsed upon it. There were no teeth marks, just evidence of a pressure so immense it defied logic. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elias knelt by the wreckage, his fingers tracing the cold steel. The realization hit him then. This was not the work of a scavenger or a simple predator. This was a deliberate statement. As the sun dipped below the canopy, casting long, skeletal shadows across the mud, the hunter felt the first prickle of fear. He realized the footage had not been a find. It was a glimpse of a power. Elias thought he was the one doing the hunting. He was wrong. The engines of the small skiff groaned as they entered the region the locals called the Dead Zone. Here, the Rio Negro lost its momentum, the current dying until the surface became a mirror of obsidian. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the interlocking canopy, casting the world in a sickly twilight. This was a stretch of the river where the maps went blank, a place where the indigenous tribes refused to venture. They believed the land was cursed, a territory belonging to something older than the forest. Every splash against the hull sounded like a gunshot in the heavy silence, and the guides huddled together, their eyes darting toward the impenetrable wall of green. To the rational mind, the size of the creature Elias Thorne sought seemed like a biological impossibility, yet science offered a chilling justification. In isolated pockets of the rainforest, where evolution took strange detours, biological gigantism was a reality fueled by lack of competition and abundant prey. In these nutrient-rich swamps, a reptile could grow without the constraints of a normal ecosystem. If conditions were right, high heat and constant protein, an anaconda could exceed 50 feet in length, becoming a living force of nature. Elias knew this. He had studied the whispered legends of the Sucuriju gigante, a creature so massive it could swallow a jaguar whole. The environment shifted as they moved further into the heart of the swamp. The water was no longer clear. It became stagnant and oily, covered in a film that shimmered like spilled fuel. It felt unnaturally deep, as if the riverbed had dropped into a bottomless abyss that swallowed the light. The air grew colder, a paradox in the tropical heat, and the usual jungle cacophony faded into an oppressive silence. Only the soft ripple of the boat's wake disturbed the stillness, sounding uncomfortably loud in the void. Caught in the skeletal roots of a massive mangrove was the carcass of a black caiman. 12 feet long, this undisputed apex predator had been bitten clean in half. There was no evidence of consumption, no missing chunks of meat or signs of a feeding frenzy. The lower half was simply gone, the spine severed with a surgical precision that suggested jaw strength beyond human comprehension. It hadn't been eaten. It had been discarded as a grisly warning to anything entering these waters. The guides crossed themselves, their murmurs growing frantic as they looked at the mangled remains. Elias stared at the remains, his pulse quickening with a dark, predatory thrill. To the guides, this was a sign to turn back, but for him, it was a confirmation. This wasn't just about debt or fame. Elias harbored a pathological need to be the most dangerous thing in the world. He viewed existence as a hierarchy of violence, and a predator greater than himself was an insult he could not endure. He needed to stand over the carcass of the titan of the depths to prove he was still the king of the food chain, the final arbiter of life and death in the wild. Suddenly, the boat vibrated with a sudden, violent intensity that made the deck plates rattle against the frame. It wasn't the engine's mechanical hum, but a low, rhythmic thumping originating from the dark water itself, pulsating with a life of its own. It was a physical sensation, traveling through the metal hull into the soles of their boots, rattling their teeth. It felt like a massive heartbeat, slow and deliberate, shaking the foundation of their reality. Along the muddy banks, something heavy and immense slid into the water with a sound like wet velvet dragging over a fresh grave, leaving only a widening ring of slick, iridescent oil on the surface. One of the guides pointed a trembling finger toward a small sandbar. Imprinted in the soft mud were a series of tracks. They didn't lead into the river from the forest. They led out, heading toward the dark, suffocating interior of the jungle. Elias leaned over the railing, his breath hitching in his chest. The tracks were not from a lizard or a serpent. They were clearly defined, unmistakably human in shape, yet far too large to belong to any man. The jungle was no longer a backdrop. It was a labyrinth. The tracks on the sandbar had paralyzed the group, but Elias Thorne refused to let the impossible halt his momentum. He forced the men back onto the boat, his hand gripped tight around the cold steel of his high-caliber rifle. They drifted further into the narrowing tributaries, where trees leaned over the water, forming a tunnel of suffocating greenery. Humidity pressed the breath from their lungs as they scanned the oily river. But the river was a lie. The threat was not lurking in the black depths this time. It was waiting in the sky. A sudden, sickening crack echoed through the silence, the sound of a thick, ancient branch snapping under incredible weight. Before any of the guides could scream, a blur of olive green and obsidian black dropped from the overhanging canopy with the speed of a falling guillotine. It was a strike. The man standing at the stern, a quiet guide who had been with Elias since the outpost, was gone in an instant. No struggle, only the muffled sound of air being squeezed from lungs, and a heavy thud followed as something massive hit the water several yards away. Elias reacted with the cold precision of a man who had spent his life killing. He shouldered his weapon and unleashed a volley of rounds into the churning wake where the guide had vanished. Muzzle flashes illuminated the gloom, but the returning sound was wrong. Instead of lead meeting flesh, bullets produced sharp metallic pings as if striking a submarine hull. Whatever was in that water possessed a hide that defied the laws of biology. The water bubbled briefly before settling back into its stagnant, obsidian stillness. When the ripples finally died down, the only thing that remained was the guide's canvas jacket, snagged on a protruding root. Elias hauled it aboard with a boat hook, but as he laid it on the deck, the guides recoiled. The fabric was soaked, not just with river water, but with a thick, viscous slime that pulsed with a faint, ghostly bioluminescence. It was a shimmering blue, a color that had no place in the muddy browns of the Amazon. It was cold to the touch and smelled of ozone and ancient salt. No freshwater reptile on Earth produced such a substance. It was a biological anomaly, a sign that the Titan was far more than a mere snake. As the hours bled into night, the psychological toll began to fracture the crew. The bravado that had sustained them evaporated, replaced by a raw paranoia. Every floating log in the moonlight became a snout. Every swaying vine became a coil ready to strike. The men spoke in hushed, trembling whispers, convinced the jungle itself was watching them with 1,000 eyes. Elias sat in the center, eyes fixed on the darkness, mind racing to reconcile the unfolding reality. He was a hunter who prided himself on understanding his prey, but this creature was rewriting the rules of the hunt. Desperate for some sense of control, Elias pulled out his tracking receiver to check the perimeter traps he had set miles downstream. He expected to see a blank screen, but instead, the device emitted a sharp, rhythmic chirp. A red dot flickered on the map, pulsing steadily. It was the GPS tag from his primary trap, the one he had bolted to a massive tree trunk 10 miles back. His blood ran cold as he realized the signal wasn't coming from behind them. The dot was directly beneath the boat, moving at a speed that was physically impossible for any creature to maintain in these winding, debris-clogged waters. The realization was a hammer blow to his ego. The creature hadn't just escaped his trap. It had taken the bait as a souvenir. It was moving faster than logic allowed, weaving through the labyrinthine swamp with a predatory grace that suggested it knew the terrain better than the maps. It wasn't following them, lurking in the shadows. It was circling them, a master tactician closing the distance with chilling deliberation. As the boat drifted deeper into the lightless heart of the swamp, the thumping began again, vibrating through the floorboards. It wasn't following them. It was herding them toward the heart of the swamp. The boat's hull groaned as it slid into the thick, stagnant silt of a hidden lagoon, bringing the expedition to a bone-jarring halt. They had drifted through a narrow passage concealed by a heavy curtain of hanging moss, emerging into a graveyard of history. Elias Thorne stepped onto the prow, his eyes widening at the sight. Before them lay a sprawling complex of ancient, half-sunken ruins that defied every map of the Amazon. These were not the crude mud-brick structures of common forest tribes. They were massive, obsidian-black stone monoliths and crumbling temples that whispered of the legendary lost city of Z. The geometry was alien, with sharp angles and soaring arches carved by unknown hands. Vines as thick as a man's torso strangled the stone, yet the carvings of giant coiled serpents remained disturbingly clear, their stone eyes seeming to follow the intruders. As the engine's echoes died away, a peculiar sensation washed over the group. The air in the lagoon was not the sweltering, humid breath of the jungle. It was unnaturally cold, a sharp, artificial chill that turned their breath into white plumes of vapor. A thick, milky mist began to roll off the black water, so dense it felt like a physical weight against their chests, muffling sound and distorting the light. The smell of the jungle, the rot of decaying vegetation, was replaced by a sterile, metallic scent of ozone. This was no longer a natural ecosystem. It was a tomb, preserved in ice. Elias scanned the perimeter, his rifle leveled at the shifting fog. To his left, partially hidden behind a toppled pillar, he spotted the unmistakable silhouette of a modern structure. It was a research tent, its fabric slick with condensation. He signaled the remaining guides to stay back and waded through the knee-deep muck toward the entrance. Inside, the scene was a jarring contrast to the ancient ruins outside. Sophisticated server racks hummed with a quiet, persistent energy, powered by a silent fuel cell tucked in the corner. Glowing monitors cast a cold blue light over piles of discarded medical equipment and vials of iridescent fluid. The hunter reached for a tablet that remained active, its screen displaying a stream of biological data. As he scrolled through the encrypted files, the truth began to pierce through his bravado. The Titan of the depths was not a freak of nature. It was an engineering marvel. Surgical diagrams showed a Titan anaconda's skeleton reinforced with carbon fiber alloys. Thermal scans pinpointed neural implants designed to interface with the creature's predatory instincts. It was a guardian, a sentinel designed to protect the lagoon's secrets. The creature Elias was hunting was a weapon of war, bioengineered to be the ultimate apex predator, possessing a tactical intelligence that no animal should have. Suddenly, the lagoon exploded in a violent upheaval. A massive, muscular tail, armored with scales that looked like overlapping plates of steel, erupted from the depths. With a sound like a thunderclap, it smashed into the boat, nearly capsizing it and sending the guides screaming into the freezing water. Elias scrambled out of the tent, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the swirling mist, the Titan's head emerged, rising 10 feet above the surface. Its skin was a mosaic of natural green and artificial black, scarred by old surgical lines. It didn't hiss or strike blindly. It waited, its eye the size of a dinner plate and glowing with a faint internal bioluminescence, fixed on Elias. There was a terrifying depth to that gaze, a cold, analytical curiosity. It wasn't looking at food, it was looking at an adversary. The creature submerged with a chilling grace, leaving the water as still as glass. Elias retreated back into the shadows of the ruins, his hands trembling. He ducked into a small stone alcove to catch his breath, but his foot struck a heavy, leather-bound portfolio, half buried in the silt. He pulled it free, the ancient leather crumbling in his grip. Inside was a single weathered photograph protected by a plastic sleeve. It was dated August 1924. It showed a hunter standing exactly where Elias stood now, his face marked by the same jagged scar across the jaw, his eyes reflecting the same ruthless ambition. The man in the photograph, staring back from across a century of shadows, was Elias Thorne. The heavens above the lagoon finally fractured, and a tropical storm of biblical proportions descended upon the ruins. It wasn't merely rain, it was a deluge that felt as though the sky had turned into a solid mass of falling water. The quiet, stagnant basin of the lagoon, was instantly transformed into a churning whirlpool of black mud, tangled vines, and ancient, jagged debris. The wind howled through the obsidian arches, creating a discordant shriek that sounded like the ruins themselves were screaming in a forgotten tongue. As the water level rose with terrifying speed, reclaiming the stone monoliths and erasing the narrow paths back to the safety of the jungle, the group found themselves trapped on the upper tiers of a crumbling temple. It was in this chaos that Elias felt the vibration. It didn't arrive as a sound he could hear, but as a pulse he could feel deep within his marrow. It was a low-frequency hum, a subsonic thrumming that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in his chest cavity. Elias recognized the sensation from his decades of tracking apex predators across the globe. Infrasound. It was a biological weapon, a silent frequency used by the ultimate hunters to paralyze their prey. The phantom vibration triggered a primal panic, a lizard brain terror that made his heart rate spike and his vision blur. The titan of the depths was close, using the rhythmic acoustic assault to tenderize the minds of its victims before moving in for the kill. The very air seemed to thicken with this unseen pressure, making every breath feel like he was inhaling cold, wet lead. The psychological weight of the infrasound snapped something fundamental inside Elias. The calculated veteran hunter was gone, replaced by a man possessed by a manic feral desperation. He no longer saw the remaining local guides as human beings, or even as subordinates. They were now merely assets in a lethal equation. With trembling hands and wild eyes, Elias began to rig inhumane traps using the last of his high-tensile wire and the remaining blocks of plastic explosives. He ignored the terrified pleas of the men as he positioned them in the most exposed gaps of the ruins, effectively using them as living bait to draw the titan out of the rising floodwaters. When the head guide looked at him with a mixture of horror and betrayal, Elias only stared back with hollow, glazed eyes. He was no longer trying to win a hunt. He was fighting to remain the top of a food chain that had already discarded him. During a brief, eerie lull in the storm, Elias retreated into the shadows of a stone alcove and pulled a crumpled, sweat-stained photograph from his inner pocket. It was a picture of his family, faces he had not seen in years, faces he had pushed away in his relentless pursuit of glory and gold. Looking at the smiling faces of his children, a sudden, sharp pang of regret pierced through his mania. He realized that if he died in this green hell, his legacy would not be one of legend or heroism. He would be remembered as a man whose ambition was written in blood and shadows, a cautionary tale of a soul sold for a trophy that didn't exist. For a fleeting moment, the weight of his ruthlessness felt heavier than the ruins themselves. Driven by a strange, magnetic compulsion he couldn't explain, Elias followed the source of the infrasound toward a darkened fissure in the cliffside behind the main temple. Pushing through a curtain of thick, bioluminescent moss, he entered a vast cavern where the temperature plummeted. This was the larder. His flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing rows of translucent amber-colored sacks hanging from the ceiling like grotesque fruit. Inside were the trophies, not just animals, but humans from various decades. He saw a man in a 1950s flight suit and a woman in Victorian exploration gear, their bodies perfectly preserved in a state of suspended decay. Their eyes moved slowly behind the film of slime, pupils dilating as the light hit them. They were alive, held in a terrifying stasis by the creature's chemical secretions. The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. The Titan wasn't hunting for food. It was curating a living collection of those who dared to trespass in its sanctuary. The creature possessed a cold, surgical intelligence, keeping its prizes as biological records of the surface world. Elias looked back at the entrance, the realization dawning on him that he wasn't being hunted to be eaten. He was being selected for the gallery. The jungle didn't want Elias dead. It wanted him to stay. Forever. The black water surged with a predatory hunger, swallowing the lower stone chambers of the temple in mere minutes. The furious currents lashed against the crumbling piers, sending sprays of silt into the howling void. Elias Thorne scrambled up moss-slicked stairs, his boots slipping on ancient stone. The air was thick with ozone and decaying vegetation. The storm had transformed the lagoon into a vertical labyrinth of drowning stone, forcing Elias into the crumbling heights. Every step was a betrayal of his body, muscles screaming under manic desperation. He was no longer the hunter. He was a cornered animal seeking high ground. The surface of the rising flood broke. The titan of the depths rose from the churning depths, shedding the weight of the Rio Negro like a dark god. It was a prehistoric nightmare, made manifest from the dark corners of evolution. Its body was as thick as a century-old redwood, covered in obsidian scales. Ragged scars, souvenirs of battles with creatures long extinct and modern machinery, crisscrossed its massive frame. Its head was a blunt armored wedge, and those dinner-plate eyes glowed with a cold hunger that felt personal. Elias leveled his high-caliber rifle, the kickback bruising his shoulder with every round sent into that massive skull. Bullets sparked against scales like flint on steel, barely drawing dark ichor. "Come on," he screamed into the howling wind. He triggered his inhumane traps. A muffled roar echoed as plastic explosives detonated, sending mud and fire into the sky. The Titan recoiled and let out a sound that vibrated through Elias's marrow. It wasn't a hiss. It was a rhythmic sequence of electronic pulses that felt more like a signal broadcast than a cry of agony. The ruins groaned under the weight of the creature's coils. It lunged with impossible speed, jaws snapping inches from Elias's perch. He scrambled higher, clawing at stone, tossing a phosphorus flare into the creature's path. The blinding crimson light illuminated the sheer, terrifying scale of the beast. It seemed to stretch endlessly into the murky, swirling depths below. The fire licked at its snout, causing it to thrash with renewed fury. Its tail smashed through a massive stone pillar, sending a shower of shards into the air like shrapnel. Elias was pinned against a collapsing archway. The ledge was fracturing under the pressure of the storm. The remaining local guide, watching Elias with horror, saw the opening. In a sudden, selfless burst of motion, the guide stood atop a stone monolith, shouting a challenge. He brandished a jagged piece of metal, drawing the Titan's lethal focus away from the hunter. The creature turned, its bioluminescent eyes shifting for a heartbeat. In that second, the guide leaped toward the beast, a sacrificial distraction that bought Elias the window he needed. Elias looked down the sights, finger tightening on the trigger. He had a clear shot at the soft tissue behind the creature's eye. But he also saw structural cracks across the temple dome. A direct hit would trigger a catastrophic collapse. He would be buried alive, trapped forever in his own dark version of the larder, crushed alongside the prize he had sacrificed everything to find. The decision was instantaneous. His breath hit the cold air in ragged gasps, and the world seemed to slow to a deadly, calculated crawl. His obsession now narrowed his existence to a single point of impact. As the Titan prepared to swallow the guide, it let out that rhythmic, mechanical drone once more. It was a song of cold metal and ancient flesh. Elias felt a cold sweat break out. He pulled the trigger. The high-explosive round struck true, throwing the creature's head back. As the heavy scales peeled away under the intense heat of the blast, something caught the light of the dying flares. It wasn't bone. Underneath prehistoric skin, a dull, metallic gleam reflected the fire. Interconnected plates and circuitry embedded into the creature's spine. The Titan was a masterpiece of biological engineering. It was not merely a serpent, but a sentinel. A living weapon forged in a lab far removed from this green hell. The temple began to cave in, and as the ceiling descended in a roar of dust, Elias stared in frozen, paralyzed shock at the cold, clinical machine that lay hidden beneath the ancient myth. The jungle didn't swallow him whole, but it chewed him until he was unrecognizable. Weeks after the cataclysmic collapse of the Lagoon Temple, a group of rubber tappers found a ghost wandering the silted banks of the lower Rio Negro. It was Elias Thorne, or at least the hollowed-out husk of the man who had once claimed to be the world's greatest hunter. He was barefoot, his clothes little more than tattered rags fused to his skin by dried mud and blood. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, were now clouded with a milky, unfocused terror. He spoke no coherent words, only a rhythmic, modulated hum that mimicked the mechanical drone of the beast. He clutched nothing but a broken camera casing, gripped so tightly that his knuckles had turned white and permanent. There were no trophies to display, no legendary skin to sell to the highest bidder, and certainly no glory to reclaim his stolen reputation. His debts remained, ballooning into a death sentence he no longer had the capacity to understand, a shadow that would haunt him for whatever remained of his broken life. The professional hunting circles that once whispered his name in awe now spoke it as a joke. The man who went into the green hell and came out a lunatic. Elias was the sole survivor of the expedition, the only living witness to the horrors of the dead zone, but his mind had remained behind in that stone larder, preserved in the same terrifying stasis as the explorers he had seen hanging from the ceiling. Far from the humidity of the rainforest, in a climate-controlled corporate laboratory in a city of glass and steel, the broken camera casing Elias had clung to was finally being dissected. Technicians in sterile white suits worked with surgical precision to recover data from the corrupted memory cards. On a high-definition monitor, a blurry, flickering image materialized. It was the final moment before the collapse. The light of a phosphorus flare illuminated a jagged tear in the Titan's neck. The technicians didn't see muscle or bone. They saw high-tensile carbon fiber struts, neural link conduits, and a series of pulsating subdermal sensors etched with a serial number. The analysis was chillingly clinical. The creature was not a relic of a prehistoric era. It was a prototype. It had been born in a tank and perfected in the wild. Those surgical scars weren't from battles with nature. They were the marks of upgrades. The Amazon hadn't been protecting an ancient secret. It was being used as a vast, unmonitored testing ground for bioengineered apex guardians designed to patrol and protect interests that transcended national borders. The truth was far more terrifying than any myth of a serpent god. Humans had taken the raw power of the prehistoric world and fused it with the cold, unyielding logic of machines. Elias Thorne had thought he was the hunter, but he was merely a variable in a stress test, a piece of biological data used to calibrate the lethality of a weapon. The Amazon does not forgive mistakes, but as Elias stared blankly at a hospital wall, the deeper tragedy became clear. Humans are the only species that repeat their errors with calculated intent. They didn't learn from the disappearance of the 1920s explorers. They used those disappearances to hide their progress, turning the deaths of brave men into the foundation of a new, terrifying science. In the final seconds of the corporate briefing, a satellite feed replaced the thermal imagery of the lagoon. The screen displayed a heat map of the upper Amazon basin. 3 distinct signatures appeared, pulsing with a vibrant, unnatural intensity. They were larger than the Titan of the depths, massive, undulating shapes moving with purposeful speed toward a densely populated river city. The experiment had moved beyond the testing phase. The predators were no longer just guarding the ruins, they were expanding their territory. Out here, survival is never guaranteed, because sometimes the predator you fear is just a puppet for something much worse. The jungle is no longer just a forest, it is an arsenal, And the world is about to realize that the most dangerous thing in the green hell isn't the snake, but the men who gave it a mind of its own.